I love that story. It just hits me so many ways. Every time I come back to it, I find something deeper and deeper that I didn't see before. Now, I'm sure I preached this maybe 4 or 5 years ago, right here in this congregation. So I remember the theme the last time was Thanksgiving. I mean, it makes sense. 10 lepers experience healing. 1 returns to Jesus with thanksgiving. There's something about the practice of thankfulness that enlarges our world. It blesses us and restores us. And it brings us into contact with others and seeing the world in a different way that is good for all. And yet, there's something very special about this story that I didn't notice the last time. This story is unique to the Gospel of Luke. Luke only. So I don't know if you've noticed when you've looked at your Gospels, but there's a lot of overlap in stories and events between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So when you get to one that is unique to any one of those Gospels, you need to pay attention. You need to slow down. And I must confess, I probably didn't look as carefully through my life at that. Why is that only found in the Gospel of Luke? Well, because Luke has something special to tell us there. Now, as I mentioned, I've preached this before in terms of the thanksgiving that we see on the part of this foreigner. Remember, that's what it said, foreigner, and leper, and Samaritan. I mean, all the categories that say this person shouldn't be thankful to a Jew, itinerant Jew, but in fact, he was. But then I looked again, and meditating on the lesson, I saw something that I missed. And I don't know about you, but maybe that happens for you from time to time in your life. You go back and you look at a passage 1 year, 5 years, 10 years later, and the stages of your life make a difference when you come to it. For example, those of us in this room, you probably haven't heard this story preached since we went through a time of pandemic, a disease that flooded our earth and changed the way we related to each other and almost stopped us overnight, took away so many loved ones, took away so many rituals that we celebrated, times together, weddings, funerals, all sorts of things were taken from us during that time. Yeah, the last time I read this passage and studied this passage was pre-pandemic. And I'm sure there's some other things that have changed your life since the last time you read that. I mean, I know I've got a little more gray hair, both on my head and in my beard. And I know the grandchildren are a few more than there were before, and it's a little louder around the house than it's been in the past. But then I noticed this gospel lesson this week, the day actually before Columbus Day, is when I'm reading it. And it hit me in a different way. I don't know about you, but when I heard this as a child in the 1960s, for me, the way we celebrated Columbus Day was with a little song. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Now this is where it gets tricky. He sailed and sailed and sailed and sailed to find this land for me and you. Okay, the grammar's wrong. And all sorts of things there, but it was a catchy little tune, and I spare you me singing it in order to make the point. It's actually amazing how much attention Western world, and America in particular, gives to Columbus, Christopher Columbus. We actually measure time in terms of everything before 1492 is pre-Columbian, and after is the modern world as it is seen. And yet, after 3 voyages, Columbus himself died in obscurity, unappreciated and penniless. So why? Why? That one just bothered me. Children have school days off tomorrow. There are few holidays on the calendar that actually go by the name of a person anymore. President's Day has been collided together, so not Lincoln, Washington, that's not that. It's very few days on the calendar. So why Columbus? Canadian Thanksgiving's tomorrow. That's something to be celebrated. But no, Columbus. Then I took a look and realized that what I learned in song as a child, what I learned in the textbooks of my grammar school, didn't really tell the full story. In fact, I was surprised to learn there was more to it in my church history books when I went to graduate school and ministry. On May the 4th, 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal decree, Inter Caetera, which paved the way for the Spanish to make their conquests of the indigenous peoples and their lands over the centuries that followed. The document supported Spain's strategy to ensure its exclusive right to the lands discovered by Columbus the previous year. It established a line in the ocean 100 leagues, I'm not sure what a league is, 100 leagues to the west of the Azore Islands. So everything on that side was deemed as the land occupied by Spain. And what we see right in that declaration by the Pope was one of those dangerous intertwinings of church, state, political power, commerce, colonialization, all coming together in one. The decree further stated that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by Christian rulers, and declared that the Christian religion be exalted by everywhere and increase the spread of and health of those who are Christian souls, and the barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. It was called the Doctrine of Discovery and became the basis of all European claims to the Americas, as well as the foundation in the United States of westward expansion. I mean, it was even as recently as 1851 argued in the it was brought before the Supreme Court, not argued, it was brought before the Supreme Court, the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and it was dismissed over the very fact of the Doctrine of Discovery was already established. As you can see, the Christian theological treatise paved the way for European political and economic expansion. And it, more importantly, decided who was human and who was not, who had rights before the law and who did not. The contemporary division of a world that is developed and undeveloped was paved off of those assumptions. We now know that Columbus's voyages transformed the modern world, and with the full sanction of the European Church, by taking the land, the wealth, the labor from indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere, and leading to their near extermination and transatlantic slave trade, and created a racial underclass. That's not a lesson I learned in my elementary school days. And we would not have really learned it either had not a friar, Spanish friar, by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas, if he hadn't have kept the records. He remarked just 50 years after the first voyage of Columbus, "What we committed in the Indies stands out among the most unpardonable offenses ever committed against God and mankind, and this trade in American Indian slaves as one of the most unjust, evil, and cruel offenses among them." Incredible. with this historic lens, how do I come back to this passage? How do you read this passage? How do we read this passage? I like that in the very beginning of this passage, it says Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, but he was in the nebulous in-between land. And I think we're in an in-between land. I think Christianity as a name has been taken and has really forced us to make a choice here. What we mean by being a Christian and a follower of Christ. So with that, I return to the story in particular. For we are reminded that those who were healed were lepers. Now remember, leprosy was considered one of those sorts of diseases that was a curse by God. Couldn't explain where it came from, and so therefore, those of the day, pre-medical sciences, would have considered this an uncanny disease that they didn't recognize where it was coming from, and therefore dangerous. And those who had leprosy were asked to remove themselves from community, and they were to cover their body and their face and their hands so as not to spread it. And if anyone comes around, they were to declare themselves unclean. And this contagious factor in the minds of the Judeans and the Samaritans at this time in Palestine would have ostracized those lepers from the community and left them homeless without the support of family or friends. And those observing Jesus in proximity of lepers would have seen this as a very dangerous interaction, one of which you must stand clear of, for the potential of spreading a disease would have been horrible. And so when Jesus engages lepers, he's crossing a line between who's in and who's out. Secondly, we return to this story and we find that the one who stands out in the story as praised is a Samaritan. Now, my friends, you have to look at the Gospel of John again, because he really goes back over and over again to who the Samaritans were and the interactions of the day. And let's just say it wasn't copacetic. It was hostile. Jesus' target audience hated Samaritans to such a degree that they celebrated the destruction of the Samaritans' temple on Mount Gerizim. The Samaritans reciprocally hated the Judeans, and the tensions between the communities was at an all-time high in the early part of the first century. The Gospel of Luke is unique in focusing on the Samaritans. Jesus has already highlighted the tension between the Jews and Samaritans in the story, and you know it, of the Good Samaritan in chapter 10 of Luke. In chapter 10, Jesus praises the actions of a Samaritan, even though the Samaritans were hated by the Palestinian Jews of the day. They would have preferred Jesus champion the priest or the Levite, but when you call the neighbor the Samaritan, the one who you are to love, it's just almost more than they can take. In fact, the answer of the crowd when Jesus said, "And who is the neighbor?" and they wouldn't say the word Samaritan. They said the one who acted appropriately. It's amazing. Now in Luke 17, Jesus praises the doubly excluded person who is both leper and Samaritan as the model of faith. In other words, you can learn of who God is and God's grace from someone who is not your religious tradition, not your national identity, but completely other. This is not just about inclusion. This is also about respect for someone different than yourself. This is an incredible story when you read it in that regard. And this passage is as much about identity as the 15th century Pope Alexander VI's doctrine of discovery. There is one crucial difference. Where the colonists were so blinded by the pursuit of wealth and land that they couldn't and wouldn't see the indigenous peoples as beloved children of God, whom they could learn something from, whom they could benefit by building relationships with, Jesus saw those discarded, separated, despised, and marginalized as models of loving neighbors, and in fact, faith itself. Jesus' message of radical inclusion, but radical respect, is fascinating. And it comes to focus right here in this doubly cursed Samaritan leper. And it challenges us to cross those same lines. That's what we celebrate today. The blessed inclusion of our Lord and the understanding of lines that separate, that make us different from each other as potential avenues and channels of blessing from the Creator God. That's why our folks are marching in the Pride Parade today. And that's why I am blessed to be in a church where we are part of a community that will go to other parts of this earth and down the street to make that message known. Now, one really interesting point about this whole historical piece. We have a ministry in Chiapas, Mexico. Bartolomé de las Casas of the 16th century, whom I mentioned earlier, who understood and recorded and all of the atrocities that were attributed to the colonizers, was a Spanish landowner. He left Spain 15 to 20 years after Columbus sailed on his first sail in 1492. But Bartolomé landed in Hispaniola as a layman, and observing what he did, he became himself a friar, and from friar to priest, and from priest, he was eventually appointed as the first resident bishop of Chiapas. As the first bishop appointed in Chiapas, he was given the title of Protector of the Indians. It is with thanks to Father Bartolomé that today we have the truth of the atrocities committed against the indigenous peoples in his short account of the destruction of the Indies. It's as his model as a social reformer and as a historian that he has preserved the voice of those silenced by the powerful in history. It's a dangerous memory, but it's a dangerous memory at the foot of the cross where we remember one other who they tried to silence. Being Christian today requires careful circumspection, for it has taken two very distinct trajectories. How we see those different from ourselves will reveal our path.